The stars had names once. The Keth called them anchor points, fixed coordinates around which the architecture of conquest could be draped like a net over still water. They had mapped every one of them. They had mapped everything. That was the nature of the Keth patient, methodical, and absolutely certain that the universe was a ledger waiting to be balanced in their favor. They were wrong about one thing. They had never mapped us. My name is Yal Moran. I'm a field correspondent for the Interstellar Press Collective, and I want to be clear about something before you read any further. I did not set out to change anything. I set out to find out what happened to a woman named Sarah Andros in a colony settlement called Harrow's End on the 5th moon of Caspian IV. That was the story. A dead woman, a quiet moon, and a question that nobody in the provisional government seemed to want answered. What I found instead was a man living in the ruins of something enormous. A man who went by the call sign Voltage, who said he was the last of something the galaxy had already decided to forget about. And by the time I understood what he was telling me, I'd walked far enough into the dark that I couldn't find the door back. This is what I know. Harrow's End had been a processing colony, minerals, mostly, with a population of about 4,000 people living in prefab hab blocks at the edge of a long flat valley that the locals called the Shelf. When the Keth first came through that sector, they didn't attack. That was the thing nobody wanted to talk about. They didn't attack, they observed. The Keth observation protocol had been documented in 4 previous contact scenarios across 3 solar systems. They send in a scouting organism, not a ship, an organism, something that reads like a dense thermal cloud on most standard scanners, and they watch. They measure response times, resource allocation, communication patterns. They are, in the most clinical sense of the word, scientists. They want to understand the thing they're about to destroy so they can destroy it efficiently. In previous contact scenarios, the observed population had typically responded with some combination of panic, military mobilization, and political collapse. The Keth had factored all of these variables into their conquest models. They were exceptionally good at predicting human behavior. They had conquered 17 colony systems in 11 years. Their record was, until a certain point, perfect. Harrow's End was not a previous contact scenario. When the thermal cloud settled over the Shelf, the 4,000 people of Harrow's End did something the Keth models had never anticipated. They sent out one man to meet it. His name had been John Hale before the war remade him. Before the augmentations and the bioelectric implants that the military research program officially designated Project Cascade, and before the fighting retreat from the Brennan system that left 37% of his nervous system rebuilt from harvested Keth neural fiber. A procedure so experimental that the 2 doctors who performed it flipped a coin to decide who would have to explain it to the ethics board afterward. One of them lost the coin flip. He said he would do it again. Hale had gone into Project Cascade as a staff sergeant with a distinguished record and a reputation for thinking sideways through problems. He came out of it as something that didn't fit cleanly into any category the military had language for. He could generate and direct bioelectric current through his hands, through conductive surfaces, through the air under the right atmospheric conditions. He could feel electrical fields the way a normal person feels temperature, as information, as direction, as threat or invitation. He could perceive the electrical signatures of living nervous systems in his immediate vicinity, which meant he was, among other things, extraordinarily difficult to sneak up on. He was also, by the time he walked out to meet the thermal cloud over Harrow's End, deeply tired. He had fought in 4 systems. He had watched the networks of augmented soldiers around him shrink contact by contact, operation by operation, until the term "the last superhero," a piece of battlefield slang that started as a joke somewhere around year 3, stopped being a joke and started being a headcount. He was it. The last one standing of Project Cascade. The last one who could do what he did. He walked out to the edge of the Shelf, carrying nothing but the clothes he'd slept in and a battered metal flask that had once belonged to his father, who had been a miner and not a soldier, and had lived to a good age and died in a bed. He took a drink from the flask, put it in his pocket, and then he stood in the gray morning light with the thermal cloud boiling toward him across the flat ground, and he waited. I asked him, when I found him months later in the ruins of what had been the colony's eastern hab block, what had been in that flask. He looked at me for a long moment. He had a face that had learned not to give much away, angular, weathered, a scar that ran from his left eyebrow to his ear, like a signature someone had drawn in a hurry. But something moved behind his eyes when I asked that. Bad coffee, he said. Coffee in the quadrant. Sarah used to say I made it like I was trying to punish myself. He didn't say anything else for a while. The silence in the hab block was the kind that has weight. Sarah Andrus had been the colony administrator at Harrow's End for 6 years. She was not, by any definition, a military person. Her background was in logistics and civil governance. She had managed food distribution networks on 2 other colony worlds before coming to Caspian IFE, and her professional reputation was built on an ability to understand systems. How resources moved, where pressure points were, what happened when a supply chain broke at the 3rd link instead of the 1st. She had also been, for about 4 years, John Hale's closest friend. The surviving colonists I spoke to described their relationship with a consistency that surprised me given how many of them there were, and how long ago it had happened. They used words like argument. They used the phrase, wouldn't stop pushing. One woman who had worked in the colony's medical bay told me that Sarah had once made Smale sit down for a full hour-long debrief after a training exercise that she had organized specifically to test the colony's response protocols, and that Hale had spent most of the hour looking like a man being politely interrogated by someone who already knew all the answers. She wasn't afraid of him, the woman told me. I think that was the thing. Everyone else who worked with him, you could see them adjusting, being careful. She just talked to him like he was a person who needed to think harder about some things. She paused. He did need to think harder about some things. What Sarah had understood that Hale had not, or had understood before he had, was that the Keth-Vorath observation protocol had a vulnerability built into its fundamental premise. The Keth-Vorath were scientists. They expected systems to behave according to models. They expected human populations to respond to observation the way human populations had always responded, with visible, measurable, modelable behavior. What they did not expect was for the population's response to be structured around an asset whose function was specifically to be unpredictable. What they did not expect was Hale. What they especially did not expect was what Sarah had spent the 6 months before first contact doing, mapping the electrical topology of the shelf, identifying the 6 points at which the geology created natural conductivity channels, building a completely undocumented network of buried copper thread conduits that connected those 6 points in a closed circuit. She had filed the project under routine infrastructure maintenance. She had done it herself, and with 2 people she trusted absolutely, working mostly at night. She called it the last resort, because she was a practical woman, and she preferred honest names for things. When I found the documentation for it in the colony's administrative archive, which had survived the battle in a hardened server vault, because Sarah Andros had been the kind of person who thought about what needed to survive, I sat with it for a long time before I could do anything else. It was a trap, not a complicated one, not elegant in the way that trap making is sometimes elegant in stories, just enormous and perfectly placed, and built by a woman who understood that the most important thing was not to be the last one standing, but to make sure the right person was. The thermal cloud hit the shelf perimeter at ACE 340 local time. This had been anticipated. The Keth-Vorath observation protocol follows a consistent timing pattern keyed to the target world's primary star cycle, and Sarah had used the collective's xenobiological records to calculate the probable attack window to within 40 minutes. Hale was already standing at the first conductivity point when it arrived. What the thermal cloud actually is, what the thing that the Keth-Vorath send as their vanguard organism actually is, had been a subject of significant scientific debate for most of the war. The working theory at the time was that it was a distributed nervous system, a kind of extended sensory organ that the Keth-Vorath main fleet used to assess combat environments before committing their primary forces. Something that thinks, but thinks slowly, and is more interested in measuring than in fighting. Hale described it differently. It feels like standing next to something that's deciding whether you're real, he told me. Like it hasn't made up its mind about whether you count, about whether you register in the part of the universe that matters to it. He took a slow breath. I've felt that before. From humans. Not from aliens. He didn't elaborate on that, and I didn't push. The cloud moved across the shelf in long rolling currents, the way fog moves over flat ground, but denser, and with a quality that the optical instruments in the colony's sensor array registered as faintly iridescent. A shimmer in the air that wasn't light but behaved like light, that bent around objects and pooled in low places. Hale stood inside it, and he felt it reading him. He stood very still. He thought about his father. He thought about bad coffee. He hummed something under his breath. Later, when I pressed him, He said it was an old Earth song, something his mother had played from an actual physical recording when he was very small. And he couldn't tell me the name of it because he'd never known the name, only the melody. He hummed it, and he stood very still, and he let the cloud read everything it wanted to read, because the most important thing in that moment was to be exactly as readable as possible. The cloud needed to decide he was alone. It needed to decide the settlement behind him was a standard human population. It needed to decide that this one anomalous biological signature, this man with the rebuilt nervous system and the bioelectric current moving under his skin like a tide, was an isolated phenomenon, not a system, not a network, not the final node in something that Sarah Andros had 6 months building in the dark. The cloud decided. It had been sent to assess. It assessed. It sent its findings back to the Keth Vorath fleet, sitting at the edge of the system's heliopause. And then, because it had no further instructions, it did what the Keth Vorath observation protocol specified that the vanguard organism should do once assessment was complete. It began to withdraw. Hale waited until he felt it starting to pull back. He waited until he could feel. In that way, he felt things that other people couldn't feel. The cloud's attention shifting away from him, the way a searchlight moves off you when it's decided you're not what it's looking for. Then he put both hands flat on the shelf, and Sarah's circuit closed. I've read the technical documentation 3 times now. I've talked to 2 electrical engineers and a xenobiological systems analyst. I want to be honest with you. I don't fully understand what happened next. What I can tell you is what the instruments recorded. The 6 conductivity points channeled every milliamp of current that Hale generated. And the Keth Vorath vanguard organism runs on bioelectric processes, runs on the same fundamental chemistry that runs every nervous system in the known galaxy, which is something the Keth Vorath understood, and which they assumed made them safe because the electrical output of a human nervous system is negligible, is nothing, is not a threat. Every milliamp he generated directly into the base of the cloud. But John Hale's nervous system was not standard. 37% of it was Keth Vorath neural fiber, harvested, repurposed, rebuilt into something that had no name because nobody had ever built it before. And what that meant, what none of the Project Cascade researchers had fully grasped until this moment, in a ruined colony on the 5th moon of Caspian IV, was that when Hale discharged into the cloud, the signal wasn't just electrical. It was recognizable, the cloud's own frequency, the cloud's own language. The vanguard organism heard its own signal come back at it amplified 1,000-fold, from below, from the ground itself, from all 6 points simultaneously, and it did what any nervous system does when it receives a signal it cannot process. It seized, the iridescent shimmer went white, then dark. Then there was a sound that the audio sensor recorded as something between a subsonic rumble and a frequency at the upper edge of human hearing. The kind of sound that makes your back teeth ache. The thermal cloud collapsed inward, not explosively, but suddenly, like a held breath finally released. And where it had been there was only the flat gray light of early morning and the smell of ozone and burned ground. Hale was on his knees. He had one hand still touching the shelf. His other hand was pressed against his chest. The medical team that reached him 7 minutes later reported that his heart had stopped and restarted twice during the discharge, and that the burns on his palms and fingers were consistent with a current load several orders of magnitude above what any human nervous system was designed to carry. He was conscious when they found him. The first thing he said was, "Did it work?" The second thing he said was, "Where's Sarah?" This is the part of the story that I had to sit with for a long time before I understood how to tell it. The Keth Vorath fleet at the heliopause received the vanguard organism's final assessment before the signal went dead. The assessment described a standard human settlement, minimal military capability, one biological anomaly of unclear threat classification. It did not describe a trap. It did not describe a network. It described exactly what Hale had shown it. The fleet received the assessment. And then the fleet received nothing. Because the vanguard organism had been destroyed. And the Keth Vorath do not send a second vanguard organism once the first one is gone. What they send instead is the full primary engagement force. Sarah Andros had known this. She had known it for 6 months. She had read every piece of xenobiological intelligence available through the collective's archives. She had run every projection. She had built the last resort because she understood that destroying the vanguard organism would trigger a primary engagement response. And she had understood something else. That the window between the vanguard's destruction and the fleet's arrival would be the only window there was. She had used that window. In the 11 hours between the Vanguard's destruction and the first Kethvorath warship entering the moon's atmosphere, Sarah Andros had organized the evacuation of all 4,000 people at Harrow's End. 4,000 people, 37 transport vessels, 11 hours. Later, the logistics scholars at the Interplanetary Institute would use it as a case study. The operational efficiency was extraordinary. The planning she had done in advance, the pre-positioned fuel stocks, the pre-assigned vessel manifests, the pre-calculated routing that took into account Caspian IV's moon system's gravitational geometry to minimize flight time to the nearest FTL jump point, was extraordinary. It was also, in every meaningful sense, her final act. Hale was in the medical bay when they told him. He had regained consciousness twice and lost it once more during the evacuation. And when he finally came back to himself properly, it was to find the medical bay empty around him. The habitat quiet in a way that habitats only get when everyone is gone. And a handwritten note on the surface beside his bed that said, in Sarah's handwriting, which I have now seen on hundreds of documents, and which is slanted slightly to the left, and has that particular quality of someone who thinks fast and writes to keep up. Stay down. We're out. Following in 15. S. He told me when I asked about the note that he had stared at it for quite a long time. She always wrote like she was already 3 sentences ahead, he said. Did she follow in 15? He was quiet. Outside the Hab block, somewhere in the ruins of Harrow's End, the wind moved across the shelf with a low and constant sound. Her transport was the last one out, he said finally. There was a Kethvorath advanced scout that came in low. One of the small ones, the kind they use for harassment runs. Her pilot tried to evade. They were about 40 kilometers out from the jump point. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The Kethvorath fleet reached Harrow's End to find an empty colony and a dead Vanguard organism and not a single living human being to process, enslave, or add to their operational models. They conducted a survey of the settlement. They found Sarah's infrastructure, the copper thread conduits, the conductivity points, and they cataloged it in the way they catalog everything, thoroughly, methodically, without any apparent comprehension of what they were looking at. One of the intelligence analysts who reviewed the captured Kethvorath survey records told me later that section describing the last resort was filed under primitive electrical infrastructure, purpose unclear. The analyst had laughed when she told me this, but it was the kind of laugh that sits close to something else. Purpose unclear. A woman had built a weapon out of a knowledge of geology, electrical physics, and one augmented man who was afraid of nothing except losing the people he was responsible for. She had built it in secret by night, over 6 months, because she understood that the only way to save 4,000 people from the Kethvorath was to give them a head start bought with something the Kethvorath's models couldn't predict. Purpose unclear. I think about that phrase more than I probably should. I found Hale because of a lead that came through an aid worker on Caspian IV's third moon, a woman who had processed evacuees from Harrow's End, and who mentioned in passing that one of them had gone back. People don't go back, I told her. This one did, she said. She looked at me with the expression of someone who has seen a great many things and filed most of them under inexplicable. He said he left something. I took a shuttle. It was a 12-hour ride, and I spent most of it reading every document I could find about Project Cascade, about the Kethvorath observation protocol, about the battle, if you can call it that, at Harrow's End. By the time I touched down on the shelf, I had a list of questions, and the knowledge that most of them were probably wrong. I found him on the 3rd day. He was living in what had been the Eastern Hab Block's community space, a large open room that still had most of its roof. He had made a fire in a salvaged metal drum, and he was sitting beside it doing something that looked, at first, like nothing. Just sitting, hands at his sides, eyes half closed. Then I noticed the arc of pale blue light moving between his fingertips and understood he was working. Calibrating something. Practicing the way musicians practice, the same motion repeated until the body remembers it without being asked. He heard me before I cleared the doorway. I know because his head moved a fraction of a degree, but didn't stop what he was doing. Press collective, he said. Yes, I said. Yale Moran. I left my camera crew on the shuttle because I thought you might be more likely to talk without them. He looked at me then. Smart, he said. He didn't invite me in. He also didn't ask me to leave. I came in. We talked for 4 days. On the first day, he told me facts, names, dates, operational parameters. The kind of information that can be found in records if you know where to look, but that he delivered in the flattened register of a man reciting coordinates. He was testing something. I understood this later. watching to see how I handled information, whether I would try to shape it or just carry it. On the second day, he told me about Sarah, not chronologically, not in the way that people tell stories when they want you to understand them. He told me in the way that loss comes back, in fragments, in angles, in the thing you remember about a person that isn't the big moments, but the specific texture of being around them. He told me that she had always had two cups of coffee in the morning, which struck him as excessive, and which she defended on the grounds that the first cup was functional and the second cup was for thinking. He told me she used to challenge him to games of stochastic logistics, a kind of improvisational supply chain problem-solving exercise that she found relaxing and that he found maddening because she was better at it, and she knew it, and she pretended not to know it, which was worse. He told me that after particularly hard weeks, she had a habit of going out to the edge of the shelf at dusk and standing there for an hour without talking, and that he had learned to recognize the difference between the silence that wanted company and the silence that didn't. She knew, I said on the third day. He looked at me. When she built the last resort, I said, she knew the fleet would come after. Yes, he said. She built it anyway. She understood the math, he said. 4,000 people against one fleet engagement. She understood the math and she decided to be the one who found a third option. Is that what she called it? Something moved across his face then, brief, controlled, but there. She called it playing the only card in the deck, he said. On the fourth day I asked him why he'd come back. He was quiet for a long time. Outside the wind moved across the shelf. The fire in the drum had burned low and he hadn't rebuilt it, and in the gray light of the habitat I could see the scars on his hands clearly. The burn patterns from the last resort's discharge, healed but deep, running in lines from his palms to his forearms like a map of something. She's buried here, he said finally. I hadn't known that. It wasn't in any of the records. The transport that was hit, he said. Some of it came down on the shelf. I came back and I buried her. Before I left, and then I thought. He stopped. He looked at his hands. I thought there should be somebody here who knows, in case somebody comes looking for the truth of it. That's what I'm doing, I said. Looking for the truth. He looked at me for a long moment. Something in his assessment reminded me, not comfortably, of what he'd said about the vanguard organism, about being red, about the thing that hadn't decided yet whether you were real. I know, he said. That's why I let you find me. I've thought a great deal about what to do with what he told me. The provisional government's official account of Harrow's End is approximately 1 paragraph long and classifies most of the operational details. The military's account is sealed. The collective's own coverage at the time amounted to 3 brief dispatches describing the evacuation as a successful civilian relocation operation, which is accurate in the same way that describing a surgery as a procedure involving sharp implements is accurate. None of these accounts mention Sarah Andros by name. None of them mention what she built. None of them mention the man who stood in the path of something that had destroyed 17 colony systems and let it read him like a book, counting on the fact that the most important chapter was the one buried underground. I am not a scholar of warfare. I am not a xenobiologist or a military historian. I am a field correspondent for the Interstellar Press Collective, and what I do is try to find out what happened in places where things happened, and tell people what I found. What happened at Harrow's End was this. A woman understood a system that wanted to destroy her world, understood it well enough to find the one assumption it had never thought to question, that the thing standing in front of it was alone, was isolated, was all there was. And she built a trap around that assumption with her own hands, in the dark, over 6 months, and she paid for it. And a man who had been remade into something between human and alien, who carried the biology of the enemy in his rebuilt nervous system, stood in an open field in the gray morning, with bad coffee in his pocket, and let that thing read him, because the woman who knew him best had told him to, and because being read was the whole point. And 4,000 people got on 37 transports and flew to safety. I don't know what the Keth Vorath put in their models after Harrow's End. I don't know if they have a category for it. I don't know if purpose unclear stayed in the record, or if some Keth Vorath analyst eventually figured out what the copper thread conduits were for. I know that after Harrow's End, the primary engagement force that came for an empty colony encountered nothing and destroyed nothing and added nothing to their operational catalog because there was nothing to add. They found ruins and absence, and the ghost of a plan they would never fully understand. I know that Caspian IV's 5th moon is still listed as an active hazard zone on most navigational charts, and that the moon called Harrow's End is technically under provisional jurisdiction, which means nobody lives there and nobody visits, except one man living in the ruins of an eastern hab block who keeps a fire in a salvaged drum and practices the motion of light between his fingers, and knows where a woman is buried who saved 4,000 people by playing the only card in the deck. I asked him, before I left, what came next. He shrugged. It was the first fully unguarded gesture I'd seen from him in 4 days, and it was somehow more honest than anything he'd said. I'll stay a while longer, he said. Then I'll see. Are there others like you? I asked. Others who came out of Project Cascade? He looked at me. The scar from his eyebrow to his ear caught the low light. No, he said. Not anymore. Is that why you stayed? I stayed, he said, because somebody should know where she is. He picked up the flask from the surface beside him, the same battered metal one, Sarah's bad coffee, and held it for a moment, turned it over in his scarred hands and set it back down. And because, he stopped. Started again, because I still think there's more to do. The Keth Vorath haven't stopped. They're slower now, careful in a way they weren't before. But they haven't stopped. And there are things I can do that nobody else can. Things she designed me to do, that she understood before I did. She didn't design you, I said. Something like a smile. Brief and not quite. No, he said. But she read the manual better than I did. He looked out through the gap in the hab-block wall at the shelf, the gray sky. The flat ground that had once been a trap and was now just ground. There will be more contact scenarios, he said. There always are. And when there are, he paused. Someone needs to be there who knows what they're doing. He said it quietly. Not like a declaration, not like a speech. Like a man finishing a sentence he had been working on for a while. I asked him how he knew when it was enough. When one person standing alone against something enormous was enough. He thought about it. You don't, he said. You just stand there. And you let it read you. And you trust that what it can't see is the thing that matters. I left Harrow's End on a clear morning. I looked back once from the shuttle at the flat valley below. The ruins of the hab blocks, the long gray shelf, the 6 points where Sarah had buried her conductivity channels, which you could see now only if you knew what you were looking at. 6 faint discolorations in the ground, hexagonal, connected by lines too subtle for a casual survey to register. A circuit still intact, waiting. Below it, in the southeastern quadrant of the shelf, there was one more discoloration in the ground, smaller than the others, unmarked by any official record, not visible on any navigational chart. The shuttle banked and the shelf fell away below me, and I sat with my recorder in my lap and the weight of 4 days of truth in my chest, and I thought about what it means to be read, what it means to stand in the open and let something see you, and trust that what it cannot see is enough. The stars outside the shuttle's porthole were bright and numerous, and the Keth Vorath called them anchor points. We had other names for them. We always have other names. That's the part they never model. That's the part they never see coming. Not the weapon, not the trap, not the man with the rebuilt nervous system standing in the gray morning. Not even the woman working by night with copper thread and geological surveys and the cold mathematics of 4,000 lives. The part they never see coming is the name you give things when they belong to you. The bad coffee that becomes a memorial. The flask that carries a person forward. The melody without a title that you hum because your mother played it and now you play it. And one day someone might hear you and not know the name of the song but remember the sound. The Keth Vorath catalogued everything at Harrow's End. They didn't know what any of it was for.